So, hello everyone. I would like to welcome you all to the February Barts Academic Afternoon. We are unfortunately still running this event online, but you can participate in the usual ways using the chat function to post questions, to make comments for speakers to respond to in the discussion sessions. So today is my great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Jennifer Lau, here to a wider audience in East London. Jennifer was going to chair the session this afternoon, completed her doctorate at the IOP, King's College. She has a background in experimental psychology, and her main interests lie in understanding mood and anxiety problems in children and young people. So in particular, her research is to investigate how various risk factors interact to influence atypical emotional and social development, and how young people use resources to prevent and overcome mental distress. And most of you will have heard that she, together with Dennis Ugreen, a professor of child and adolescent psychiatry, is leading the newly established Youth Research Resilience Unit, or the other way around. I always get this wrong, Youth Resilience Research Unit at QMUL. And this is one of the three groups now at the newly configured Center for Psychiatry and Mental Health at QMUL. So today's session has the title Bouncing Back: What Factors Contribute to Youth Resilience and How Can We Boost These? And we're very grateful actually to Jennifer and colleagues that they've been able to put this excellent program together at rather short notice. So I would like to hand over to you, Jennifer.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for that nice welcome, Frank. So my co-director, Dennis Ugrin from the Youth Resilience Unit, I think we're going to drop research precisely for those reasons, apologizes for not being able to be here today. But I'm really, really excited about the program this afternoon. Obviously, it's a topic that's very close to my heart, but also we have a fantastic lineup of speakers, and I will introduce you to each of those as we just before their talks. But really, it's not the individual talks that they're giving today, but the kind of synergy between the talks, the fact that they all have a slightly different approach or perspective to measuring and understanding resilience that I hope will be offer you a richer insight into this topic. Now, before we start with those talks, we thought we would do a little bit of a warm-up exercise, so like stretches before you go jogging. And we want to know from you as clinicians and practitioners and people who might interact with young people, what your thoughts are about resilience. So what it is, what factors matter in building emotional resilience in young people, and what support you perceive there to be for young people. So I am going to share my screen, and we're going to do this via a little interactive software. Although hopefully for those of you who have already typed in your response, what you can see here is a kind of word cloud where the size of the word indicates how many people have used that word to describe resilience. So strength is looking like a kind of a big, a common response. Strength and strong. Bouncing back and perseverance. Recovering from difficulty, independence, toughness, coping, ability to bounce back, resourceful, determination, courage, robust, and toughness. Okay, excellent. Okay, so then the next thing we want to get your views on is what factors do you think build emotional resilience in young people. So it's important to remember that resilience is about different domains as well. And what we're interested in here is emotional resilience. So we've got strong family base, attachment, parents, a lot of family factors, financial security, so socioeconomic status, general social support or community support, again, sort of family and support networks, safe home environments, social relationships, background, faith, that's an interesting one, being supported to manage it. So not only it being an individual's responsibility to manage something, but also having the support to do that. Positive role models. And so in other words, that might not just be a family thing, could be broader than that. And with young people, that could be teachers or other adults. Temperament. So perhaps that's one of the first kind of individual specific traits or capacities that people have talked about. A lot of this seems to be kind of social and the broader community, which is interesting. And self-regulation, schooling, the school environment. So modeling, again, like role models, life experience. Okay, so I think I'll skip on to the last question now. Oh, how do I? Okay. Oh, so what sources of, sorry, I think I started off with this question by mistake, but what sources of support outside of the NHS do you think have been helpful in building emotional resilience in young people? So we've got church, young minds, charities, schools and friendships, social media when used correctly, community support, so youth clubs, volunteering, extracurricular, again, youth groups, sports centres, not much, oh dear. Family, friends, mentor figures. Right, okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So hopefully that's whetted your appetite to think a little bit more about resilience in young people. So with that introduction, I think I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Gemma, who, Gemma, do you want to switch on your camera as well? So Gemma is a research fellow at the Centre for Society and Mental Health at King's College London. So Gemma, I found out today through Google, started off with sort of an interesting career. She started off with a BSc in Sport and Exercise Science. I hope I've got the right Gemma here. You can correct me if I'm wrong. But then decided to complete a doctorate in epidemiology. So she was then based at Imperial before moving to King's, where she now coordinates and works within Reach. So this is part of her overall research interests in the social determinants on mental health and mental ill health among young people from diverse backgrounds. So in her talk today, she will introduce and present some of the emerging findings from Reach, which is an accelerated cohort study of young people in inner London city schools. So I will pass over to you, Gemma. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Jenny. I am not, it's telling me that I can't, my screen sharing function is disabled.
Do you want to reshare again?
Brilliant. There we go. Thank you, Charmin. And thank you for helping me onto the call earlier when I was having other tech issues. All right, can you see the PowerPoint?
Yeah, perfect.
All right, thanks very much, everybody. I'm so rubbish with tech. You'd have thought we'd have got there by now after doing this online for 2 years. So thank you very much for the invite to talk. I'm actually talking on behalf of Craig Morgan, the principal investigator for Reach, who wasn't available today. As Jenny said, I'm a research fellow at the Centre for Society and Mental Health at King's College London, and I work on mainly on Reach, which is a cohort study that I'm going to introduce today, and maybe say a bit about some of the emerging findings. So just to say a bit about the centre. We're all about understanding the impacts of society on mental health, and I work in the programme of the group that are looking at kind of the young people's mental health, and we're particularly interested in the impact of social transition and social change on young people's mental health. And Reach is, I guess, kind of the flagship study within that programme of work. So we started Reach about 5 or 6 years ago, and I will, and you'll hear as I go, I guess, that Reach was set up to look at kind of risk and protective factors and resilience in the development of mental health problems among young people from diverse backgrounds. But I just to manage expectations before I crack on, I guess most of what I'm going to talk about today, the analyses that I share, are, I guess, going to be more angled towards kind of how we might conceptualize risks as opposed to resilience. But I hope, and the main reason for that is that some of the core analyses that we plan to do on Reach in relation to resilience have been delayed slightly by COVID, and instead we've redirected our efforts in the last year and a half to looking at the impacts of the pandemic on young people from different backgrounds. So I'm hoping this talk will still be useful to people. I'll talk for a bit about Reach, introduce the study design, the kinds of data that we have that might be of interest to people. And then I'll talk a bit about some of the emerging findings from kind of analyses we've done pre-COVID, and then to some of the stuff that's coming out on the impacts of the pandemic. And then maybe just say a bit about next steps, which, as I say, kind of involves more on the kind of resilience angle. So just to, I'm sure this probably you've heard this a million times, a bit of background to Reach. So Reach is a localised cohort study. We're based in South London in the boroughs of Lambeth and Southwark. I guess one of the reasons we set Reach up is because a lot of what we know about adolescent mental health in this country is based largely on data from nationally representative cohort studies, which are super useful, and we've got some really brilliant cohort studies in this country. But I think with mental health, I think everybody probably knows there's a lot of evidence to show that context matters. The context in which we live, location, our background, and so on, influence our mental health. And if you look at research that's been done on adults in this particular area of London, generally there's evidence to show that rates, incidence and prevalence of mental health problems are higher in this area compared with what's reported nationally. There's also, I guess, because of a lot of our understanding of adolescent mental health, at least in epidemiology, is based on nationally representative studies. Generally, when they're not able to kind of get at the more fine-grained analyses of looking at impacts from among, or kind of the rates and incidence of mental health problems among young people from diverse social and ethnic backgrounds, and intersections of those identities. So Reach was kind of set up, I guess, to look at the extent and nature of mental health problems. It's specifically in inner city London. We're based in inner city London schools, which I'll talk about in a minute. And we're interested in the extent, nature and development of mental health problems among young people locally, and which factors increase and decrease their risk of developing a mental health problem during adolescence. So Reach is an accelerated cohort study, which it just means that, so cohort study being that we are tracking a group of young people over time, and accelerated cohort study meaning that we actually have several cohorts cohorts moving simultaneously through time, and they've got 3 cohorts of young people, and they're all at baseline. They were all 1 year difference in age, and what that allows us to do, as I'll illustrate on a later slide, is to, I guess, cover a longer developmental period in terms of the number of years of age that we can cover, but only collecting data over a kind of a shorter time period, which I'll illustrate in another slide. So we've been working with 12 secondary schools in inner city London, in Lambeth and Southwark. These are mainstream secondary schools in really diverse areas, and with these schools we've basically done a lot of work alongside the research on building really strong partnerships with these schools and the young people in those schools. And if anyone's interested, I can say a bit about the kind of co-production and engagement aspect of Reach, which is pretty strong and possibly the most exciting part and bit that we're really proud of. And from those 12 secondary schools, we recruited at baseline a cohort of just over 4,000 young people who were at the time in years 7, year 8 and year 9, so age 11 to 14. And we invited those young people to complete a computerized questionnaire for us on these little tablets that are shown in this picture at the bottom. And that questionnaire covered, I guess, broadly their mental health, things that we think might increase or decrease their risk of developing mental health problems, and then kind of socio-demographic information and these other aspects to it, which I'll say a bit about in a minute. And then a year later, we went back into the same schools and tried to get the same group of 4,000 young people to complete this very similar questionnaire 1 year later, and then again a year after that. And that was initially what Reach was set out to do. So we initially aimed to collect 3 waves of data collection in these 3 different cohorts of young people. And then COVID happened, and we kind of sprung into data collection mode again and went back to the cohort and invited them to complete questionnaires through the pandemic, which is kind of broadly T4 at the bottom there. We collected data just in the kind of first lockdown period, and then again in the last academic year and this current academic year. So to illustrate the study design, so we got kind of, I guess, say 3 cohorts who are all moving simultaneously in parallel through time. The first cohort, cohort 1, were age 11 to 12 in the first baseline in time 1, and they were in school year 7. And then they were followed up 1 year later when they were in year 8, and 2 years later when they were in year 9. Likewise, we had another cohort that were in year 8 at baseline, so age 12 to 13. They were followed 1 year later when they were in year 9, and another year later when they were in year 10. And the third cohort, they were in year 9 when we first started, and they've been followed at year 10 and year 11. And this is accelerated cohort design. So we've basically collected 3 waves of data, but it allows us to kind of, well, with certain assumptions and statistical models and so on, make assumptions about a developmental period that spans 5 years age-wise, so from age 11 to 16, but with the benefit then of not having to collect data for 5 consecutive years, but 3 consecutive years. And then this allows us to look at kind of trajectories of mental health over time, and we can use things like kind of latent growth models and so on to I guess crudely to kind of join the trajectories from across the 3 cohorts. So in red here, this might be a trajectory. This is an externalizing score trajectory for the youngest cohort. In blue is the second, the next cohort, and then in green is the oldest cohort. And so you can kind of combine these and look at just a trajectory across 3 waves, or you can instead kind of use the overlapping segments of these adjacent trajectories to instead make inferences about the mental health trajectory across a 5-year period, 5 school years, or 5 kind of years in chronological age. And just to quickly say a bit about the characteristics of the cohort. So this is just sample characteristics from baseline. So our target population was young people in key stage 3, so years 7, 8 and 9 in Lambeth and Southwark. And these are the characteristics of that target population. And here are the Reach cohorts combined and then separately. And just to say, I guess the main thing is that the cohorts are highly representative, so 50-50 boys and girls, around a quarter on free school meals, so low-income households, and then highly diverse in terms of ethnic background, with around 15% identifying as white British, and around half from Black African and Black Caribbean backgrounds, and then several other groups that are also quite large in quite large communities in the area. Likewise, highly representative across each cohort. And this gives us, I guess, a sample that allows us to do things, as I said earlier, a bit more fine-grained in terms of looking at differences by ethnic and social group. So in terms of the types of data that we've collected, this is kind of what was in the questionnaire before COVID. So we've captured mental health, various types of mental health problems, as you'll see, so general mental distress, and then also marks of anxiety, depression, self-harm, behavioural problems, psychotic-like experiences, and other things. And then things that we think might increase or decrease risk of developing mental health problems over time. So things like the family and home environment, the neighbourhood environment, school environment, racism, discrimination, poverty, difficult life events, bullying, and so on. And things that might be protective, like social support networks, coping strategies, financial security, and so on. And then a subsample of the 4,000 plus that have been doing those questionnaires, a subsample of around 800 of those kids have also been completing more in-depth assessments with us. So this includes like a 2 to 3 hour long face-to-face interview with us that tries to get in more in-depth information on some of those things that we're getting in the questionnaire, partly so that it's more detailed information and partly to corroborate what we're collecting as self-report questionnaire data. And then also some kind of tasks that look at social and neurocognition. And then around half of those kids have also been doing some a bit more innovative. They've been taking part in a virtual reality task that looks at their reactions to certain social situations. And some of them have also provided a hair sample for cortisol. So I'll just go on to say a bit about what we were finding pre-pandemic, to paint the picture, I guess. And this is using data from the SDQ, which is a 25-item questionnaire that looks at behavioural and emotional difficulties among young people. And those who score above a score of 18 out of 40 on this measure are considered to have, I guess, probable mental health problems. It's a screening tool rather than a kind of clinically diagnostic measure. And this is just showing the proportion who hit that threshold on the SDQ, so would be considered to have kind of probable mental health problems or kind of high distress, however you want to term it. And then just comparing against with the same measure or similar measures, reports from a cohort called DASH back in the early 2000s in London, and then 2 nationally representative cohorts, Understanding Society, which did use the SDQ, and the MHCYP, which has used various measures, and this comes from their kind of more in-depth DUB assessments. And in which we found that this is a baseline again, so around 1 in 5 young people in inner city London struggling with their mental health, compared with generally around kind of between 1 in 7 and 1 in 10 in nationally representative studies and historically in London. And if you look at that by type of mental health problem and by gender, I see that across all types of mental health problems, girls are more likely to be struggling than boys, and this is apparent for depression, for anxiety, and for lifetime self-harm. Though I think quite interesting that the difference here is not, I think, not as large as I thought we perhaps expected it to be, and quite, I guess, striking really that 12% of boys self-harming by the age of 11 to 14. I think potentially would expect it among girls. And the gender difference in all of these mental health outcomes kind of becomes more prominent over time, or with age, sorry. So in year 7, there's very little evidence of a gender difference in risk of mental health problems. And then by year 9, there's kind of a 2 to 3-fold increased risk of mental health problems among girls compared with boys. This is particularly prominent for anxiety. I don't think I've got the slide, but for anxiety, it's around, the risk ratio is about 3 for girls in year 9. And then if we look at kind of behavioural problems, conduct problems, again from the SDQ, a subdomain of the SDQ that looks at behavioural problems, And this is looking at the proportions kind of hitting a threshold for conduct disorder, and comparing that with reports from the Millennium Cohort study, which is the nationally representative cohort, and this is from their sweep at age 14, and then again from the national survey, so the MHCYP, and this is really where the most striking difference is I guess seen for young people in London, that the elevated levels of distress in young people locally seem to play out more as behavioural problems as opposed to emotional problems. And a PhD student of ours has been doing some work looking at kind of social risk factors for conduct problems, and whether these explain some of the differences by different across different social groups. And here you can see, I guess, the broad message here is that kind of all these social risks are associated with an increased risk of conduct disorder. So, for example, experiencing racial discrimination around twice as likely to hit that threshold for conduct disorder on the SDQ compared with those who don't report racial discrimination. And likewise, we can look at kind of peer networks and low-income households and so on, all associated with increased risk of conduct disorder. And I think something that often comes out in the literature is this kind of a difference in conduct problems by ethnic group, and we did see that for certain ethnic groups there's an increased risk of conduct disorder, but generally when you start accounting for those social risks which are disproportionately experienced by many minority ethnic groups, with many of these differences then are attenuated. Okay, so, and then if we look, that was all cross-sectional. If we look longitudinally at this, so these are trajectories, behavioural trajectories from year 7 to year 11 in school. And we can do, this is from a growth mixture model, which is, I guess, more of a data-driven approach where you can look at kind of latent subgroups of individuals that kind of share similar trajectories. And from this, we can pull out kind of a group that seems to have persistently high scores on the behaviour measure, so high scores on behaviour or troubling behaviour, I guess, over time. And then a group who have kind of persistently good behaviour over time, and then the two groups in the middle, one that's kind of improving over time and one that's worsening over time. And for each of these, we can then look at, in a multinomial regression model, the association, the differences by group, but also then the association with social risks. What's interesting here, I think, is that something that's widely reported in the literature is the difference between boys and girls in behavioural problems, whereby generally boys are considered to be more at risk of behavioural problems than girls. We don't see that in our cohort, and then if we look at all these different social circumstances and experiences, and map those onto these trajectories, you can see that for each of these things, they're associated with an increased risk of being in the kind of difficult behaviour, for like persistently, we call this persistent behavioural problems over time. For example, those who have experienced 3 or more difficult life events by the age of 11 to 14 are around 6 times more likely to be in this persistent behavioural problems trajectory compared with the good behaviour trajectory, and 3 times more likely to be in this kind of worsening behaviour over time trajectory. Likewise with racism, 3 times more likely to be in that persistent behavioural problems group. Likewise for free school meals, 50% more likely to be in the persistent behaviour group. So I guess what we're saying overall is that this elevated rates of mental distress among young people locally seems to be driven mainly by conduct problems, and these behavioural problems are driven very strongly by social circumstances and experiences. And I'm conscious that I've only got a few minutes left, so I will pick out just a few things that we've been doing during the pandemic. So we went back and invited the same group of young people to complete questionnaires about their experiences and their mental health during the first lockdown period. And we were looking to see whether there's any evidence for an increase in the prevalence of mental health problems at this time point. So this is early in the pandemic compared with pre-pandemic, and we didn't find any evidence to suggest there was an increase. But this kind of masked a rather mixed bag in a lot of variability and impacts. So overall, no evidence for impact, but some groups were impacted more than others. Some seem to have kind of a relatively positive experience during that first lockdown. Others seem to have a very difficult experience during that first lockdown, as we might expect to be the case. And the experiences differed strongly by social and ethnic groups. So, for example, if you look at concerns and worries that were reported during this time, minority ethnic groups and those in low-income households are more likely to report concern, like severe worries about things like not having enough money, not having enough food to eat, and so on, and their future prospects. And then if we look at kind of change, these are changing from fixed effects models, change in distress scores from pre to post-COVID or pre to mid-COVID by different risk factors. What we generally found was that when we looked at the association with pre-COVID circumstances, generally the picture was that the inequalities that were already there before had persisted but not really widened, and instead those that were most impacted negatively with their mental health during that first lockdown are those that had the most difficult the kind of direct consequences of the pandemic and the social restrictions. So, for example, those who said that their relationships with their family got a lot worse during lockdown, their mental health, the distress scores on the SDQ went up by about 2.5 points, quite a big jump, not often reported. And then those whose relationships got a lot better, their distress decreased by 2 points on the SDQ. We're continuing to collect data. This is just incoming. This is very prelim, but just incoming from last academic year. We're just doing the analyses now. Suggests that whilst we saw this kind of slight dip in the first lockdown, there's now been a jump in that second. This is when they've returned to school and kind of maps on with lockdowns 2 and 3, a jump in the prevalence of mental health problems. And this is particularly gendered patterns. So for girls, they've jumped up to kind of higher than their pre-COVID levels of mental distress. Whereas for boys, it's kind of stable. We're collecting another wave here. It'd be interesting to see what happens next with that trajectory. And what we hope to do next, what we're working on at the moment, is again looking at these growth mixture models to see if we can identify a subgroup of young people who have been particularly kind of affected in terms of their mental health by the pandemic. And I guess illustrated here by this kind of deflection that we hit COVID here. This is the third wave of data, fourth wave of data, fifth wave of data. And if we can identify a subgroup like this, then we can look at the potential risk factors for being in this trajectory versus, for example, these groups who seem to have perhaps been stable over time or perhaps experienced an improvement in their mental health over time. I think I'll end it there because I'm probably out of time.
You have a minute left.
Oh, I have a minute left. Oh, great. Thank you. That means that I've probably motored through it and I'm not sure if anyone understands me when I'm speaking at the speed of light. So I guess just to say other stuff that'll be coming out soon. We've done some video diary work as well during the pandemic. So we had a group of just under 50 young people, half from low-income households. They were completing diary entry for us, so either audio or written diaries during the second and third lockdown period, so kind of like September to January last year. And there's some stuff coming out at the moment. There's a video up on our website if anyone wants to have a look at the emerging findings from that. It's a qualitative study, so it's more about the kind of day-to-day experiences of disadvantaged young people during lockdowns. And going, I guess, maybe next time you host one of these events, if you come and say something a bit more about specific to resilience, and we'll hopefully have some more analyses there to share. And just to end with a big thanks to all the young people who work on our study and who advise us on our work and work as co-researchers in our team.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Big round of applause, I'm sure, from the audience. Right, so we have 5 minutes for questions. So if people put any questions they have for Gemma in the chat, and we can read from there. So someone has asked, was there a similar study done elsewhere in the UK?
So there's, I guess, similar to Reach in terms of the kind of localized approach to running a cohort study. There's something similar that I mentioned in the talk called the DASH study, which was done 15 to 20 years before Reach in the early 2000s, and was a secondary school based cohort study running in inner city London. They only collected 2 waves of data, and they've recently tried to pilot kind of a third follow-up when the participants are now kind of in the mid-20s. And I think they're working through the kind of the logistics of how to do that with the whole cohort. But it'd be quite interesting if they do manage to do subsequent follow-ups when they're in adulthood, because it would give us a direct comparison, a decent comparison really of through that transition period to adulthood, which is, I guess, increasingly fraught and prolonged for young people nowadays, and looking back to how that's changed in the last 15 to 20 years, given all the social changes that we've experienced. And then in terms of similar data sources, there's the nationally representative studies, so Millennium Cohort Study and the MHCYP probably being the 2 big ones, but then there's also ALSPAC and the other cohort studies that are slightly kind of generationally behind us.
Okay, so thank you. So the next question is about the trajectories of behavioural problems, whether or not these carry on into adulthood and become higher rates of mental health problems, and also the higher rates of behavioural problems in those who experience high rates of racism. Are those behavioural problems an understandable response to the racism? And what can we do to help young people on those trajectories? That's all from one person.
Yeah, so I guess on the first question, in terms of what we can say based on our data at the moment, the cohort are currently aged 17 to 20, I think, this wave. So we'll start to be able to look at, and they're going to be, once we finished our work focusing on the impacts of COVID, the next focus of Reach is all about the transition to adulthood and looking at those trajectories through from early adolescence into adulthood, and whether, for whom do they persist and for who do they kind of relent and so on over time, and then we can do some work looking at kind of, for that group whose problems in adolescence crystallize and become longer term problems, what were the risk factors, and conversely the protective or lack of protective factors that could have prevented that from happening. So in terms of from Reach, I couldn't give you anything concrete on it, but there is generally evidence out there to show that a decent proportion of young people who experience mental health problems during adolescence then go on to experience them in adulthood. I think what's the widely cited one is that around 50% of adults who have mental health problems first kind of start struggling with their mental health during adulthood. So there does seem to be continuity, but at the same time, I think it's a relatively small proportion, maybe 5 to 10%, that have persistent problems through that whole trajectory into adulthood. And I think it's interesting that a lot of people do struggle with their mental health in adolescence and do not then struggle with mental health in adulthood. And these are the kinds of questions we hope to be able to answer with our analyses, like who are those people and why is that the case? I think something that Reach gives us the ability to do that isn't possible with some of the other longitudinal studies is that we've collected data annually, so we get really kind of good tracking. I mean, if we could go more frequently, it'd be great, but we could kind of track that trajectory more closely because we have more frequent ways of data. Whereas in most cohort studies, they'll kind of collect data, say, every 3 years, and so you don't know what's going on in between those 3-year intervals. So I hope that's the first one. On the second one. Yeah, I mean, if you're being discriminated against, I think I think it would be fine. It would be a normal response to be frustrated, to be annoyed about it. And I think we know that that institutional racism is still a massive problem here. We know that it's in the education system. We know that it's in the health system. Young people from some minority, not all, but some minority ethnic groups are massively disadvantaged from a very early age. And I guess I think the person who asked the question talked about kind of whether these are normal responses. I think something that we're really interested in as a group is understanding more, like, I think sometimes we tend to over-medicalize mental health problems or distress when it's actually a very kind of, rational response to things that have happened. So, even things like the reaction to COVID, there's a profound social change, and so you'd expect there to be some kind of evidence of things changing on measures of mental health. But, of course, it's massively changing our lives. So you would expect it. It's a normal response. And so I think sometimes we go a bit too far and over medicalize things that are just, that they then kind of lead us down a path of talking about medical responses and interventions to distress, when really we should be trying to tackle the kind of the thing that caused it in the first place.
Right.
Is that so?
So there are still some questions both in the Q&A and in the chat, and I wondered whether or not, Gemma, you would mind kind of going through some of those and answering those in the Refugee Forum. Whilst we move on to the next speaker, who is going to be Vicky Bird. So Vicky could maybe start sharing her slides. So Vicky is a professor of mental health care here at Queen Mary. I think she joined Queen Mary in 2014 after completing her PhD in health services, also at King's College London within the IOPPN. And since then, she's worked with young people and adults with severe mental illness and those experiencing distress, and looking at new ways of working within the community. She's currently running a huge number of large and small scale projects across the globe, which focus on using community resources, particularly the arts, to help individuals overcome mental distress. And I think it's one of these projects that she'll be telling us about today. So I'm going to hand over to Vicky.
Lovely, thanks Jennifer. And it was almost like we planned this. The particular study I'm going to talk about today, Orla, is all about looking at those adolescents who do go on to recover from mental health distress. And that was actually one of the aims, and it may sound like it's a little bit of a coincidence, but you'll notice quite a striking similarity with what Gemma was talking about, and one of the reasons being that Craig Morgan is also one of the co-applicants on this particular project. So I'm going to talk about the building resilience and resources to reduce depression and anxiety in young people from urban neighbourhoods in Latin America, or as we like to call it, for I think quite obvious reasons, ORLA, so studying mental health in young people. So ORLA is a 5-year programme of research that's funded by the MRC. But what's unique about ORLA is it's very much a multidisciplinary approach to looking at mental health and looking at resilience in particular. And it's made up of a team which includes people in public health, but also, crucially, as we'll come to find out, people in the arts. And it's a collaboration doing very similar work to REACH, but over in Latin America. And we have 3 partners in universities in major cities, in Javellana in Bogota, the Catano in Lima in Peru, and also the University of Buenos Aires. And we're also joined by People's Palace Projects, who coordinate our amazing range of artists in Brazil. So I wanted to just point out our amazing arts organisations right at the start, because they have played perhaps an even bigger role than we were expecting in this project. And one of the reasons being is that as we had to interrupt and move everything online because of the pandemic, it was the arts organisations that stepped in to provide a lot of input to young people, particularly people experiencing distress, and to keep some of their activities going by running online workshops. So we had originally had 5 partners, but at the moment we're working with 3 key partners. So the first one is Crea Valle La Peña, which is in Buenos Aires. They are all around sort of spoken word, but also visual arts and movement and dance. So they really cut across a whole sector of the art and focus particularly on people from more disadvantaged backgrounds. We next have in Lima, Teatro La Plaza. Now they are a theatre company all about writing and performance that focuses particularly on social change and involving young people. And actually, whilst I was in Lima, I got the chance to go to one of their productions, which was a play where all the actors have learning disabilities, in particular Down syndrome, and each one of them played Hamlet. And if I could just set the scene that I'm not fantastic with Shakespeare, I'll hold my hand up. I also don't speak any Spanish. So going to see Hamlet in Spanish was a real eye-opener, but it was an absolutely wonderful performance because it was much more about living with learning disabilities within the context of Peru. And finally, we have Batuta in Bogota, which are a music organisation. They particularly work with victims of armed conflict and the children who have been exposed to armed conflict and displacement. And they do this through formal musical education in orchestras, but also through musical writing, through mother and baby groups, and really reach out to the community. and they provide a lot of structure, and they provide all the instruments. So these three partners have really been holding together some of the work that we've been doing in Latin America. So what is Aula about? So we heard from Gemma actually that, about the importance of youth mental health, and in particular depression and anxiety we know are the leading cause of youth disability worldwide. In fact, if you look at mortality rates, suicide is the second largest cause of mortality in under 24s. The only larger cause is road traffic accidents. And we know that the risk for poor mental health, particularly common mental health disorders, is greater when you have multiple stressors. So this can be poverty, could be social isolation, but also things such as being victim of armed conflict, being displaced and having lots of violence, common experiences within the populations we're working with in Latin America. And even being in an urban environment itself has been linked to increased rates of mental health problems. Now, why our particular focus on Latin America? Well, Latin America is the most urbanized region in the world. A high percentage of the population live in megacities within Latin America. But it's also the youngest population in the world, where a quarter are under the age of 25 years old. So you've got all of this sort of melting pot of the different risk factors combined with being in a highly urbanized region and combined with being a very young population. So it presented a great ground for us to really study and investigate what happens for people who experience mental distress. It's also worth thinking about particular studies we're working in. Now, sometimes when you say things like Buenos Aires or Lima or Bogota, you may think of images like this. This is what typically comes from your tourist guides, your sort of trail finders or something. And this is probably the image I had when I think of Latin America. I don't instantly associate it with being many of the poorest countries in the world. But the reality for a lot of our young people is that they tend to live more in conditions like this. And this is areas of high social deprivation, high population density, where there's a lack of privacy, a lack of personal space, and there's a lack of often basic facilities, including medical facilities within the regions that many of our young people are working with. And in Aula, we're working with the 50% poorest population in each of the big cities. So we're not focusing on the extremes of poverty, but we're wanting to focus on people towards the lower end of the socioeconomic status. So why Aula? What do we actually aim to investigate? Well, this is something that was raised in Gemma's talk, but we know that there are many stress factors for mental health problems, yet the vast majority of young people still do not go on to develop anxiety and depression. And crucially, those who do develop anxiety and depression, around 50% will recover spontaneously within a year. And this is without the help of any mental health services or mental health professionals. So this led us to the question of, well, what factors prevent and protect individuals from developing these disorders in the first place? And what are the factors that help to promote recovery should individuals experience mental health distress? So taking these two questions, we built the Aula programme. So our main aim of Aula is to identify the resilience factors that help young people living in these environments to prevent and recover from anxiety and depression. And we're doing this for a range of work packages. First of all, we wanted to look at, well, what actually does resilience mean to young people? And it was really interesting to see the ideas that came up in that exercise to begin with, as you'll see that many of the ideas are echoed in what the young people said when we talked about, well, what does resilience mean to you? Because we knew if we wanted to measure resilience, we had to measure something that was meaningful to young people. We also conducting, this is particularly the influence of Craig, a longitudinal cohort study where we're actually at baseline we're determining whether someone scores positive for mental distress. So these aren't necessarily they would have a diagnosable condition of anxiety or depression, rather they're scoring up on a scale-based measure, so they're meeting threshold for mental distress. So at baseline, we're looking at the differences in service use and resource use between individuals who do have anxiety and depression or symptoms of mental distress and those who don't. And we're then, over a period of 1 year, following up all of the individuals who had mental distress at baseline to see who goes on to spontaneously recover. We know from the research that around 50% should. So we're wanting to look at, well, what factors do they use And is there any difference in the resource use across the different groups that might be able to be then harnessed and used for future preventative interventions? So it's a few years in, and this is what it looks like in terms of work packages. I won't go through this in much detail now because we're going to go through each of the areas in a little bit more detail, but we've now completed work package 1. This was when like the height of the pandemic hit, so we were due to do lots of in-person pilots and focus groups and arts workshops, and much of this was moved online, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And we're now at the stage where we've completed the baseline for the cross-sectional study, and we're running the ESM, the Experiential Sampling Method study. We're currently running the baseline for that and collecting the data. And then over the next year, 2 years, we'll be following up people and starting our case studies of good practice. So what do we actually do to help people? How can we take these resources and turn them into interventions? And it's worth bearing in mind that throughout this, our focus is on community initiatives. So although we obviously recognise the huge role that mental health services can play, we're talking about individuals who live in low and middle income countries where there may not be access to formalised mental health services, or where mental health services mainly revolve around hospital, inpatient care and medication. So we're particularly focused on, well, what exists in the community? What is it about the community and your family, your friends and your peers that can help you overcome periods of distress that we could then harness and use for other young people across the world? So our work package 1, so we have some findings from our first work package. Now we had 2 forms of group activity that we conducted with our young people. All of our young people are either aged 15 to 16, which sort of captures that last sort of few years at school, or we wanted to focus on young adults aged 20 to 24. And we're actually going to be looking at whether there's differences between the 2 age groups. We decided to do that rather than continuing, was because we wanted to see sort of the difference between people being in more formal education and those people that have then transitioned through into adulthood without that sort of messy, blurred stage around sort of 18 years of age. So we've got 2 distinct groups, but they're still similar enough in age, and they're still covered within the World Health Organization definition of youth. So in total, we looked at doing some focus groups with young people, but also different professionals, whether or not they were mental health professionals, youth workers or organisations who work with young people. And we did in total 18 sort of standard classic focus groups. But we also conducted 12 arts workshops with our arts partners, which used very different methodology to explore not only what depression and what resilience means to people, but also what resources people use. And this was particularly good for getting creative ideas and to get people to think outside the box. Now, when we met in Lima in November 2019, as we were planning all these activities, obviously no one had any idea of what was about to happen. So what ended up with happening is all of our activities were moved online. I'll come on later to the situation as it is in Latin America at the moment, but things are still not very much open. So pretty much all the activities that I'm going to talk to the rest of this talk are all going to be things that happened online. So please bear in mind some of the limitations that when we were talking about the 50% poorest populations in each of these cities, yet people were still required to have some form of digital access. So we're very cognizant of the fact that we may be not capturing some of the people who suffer from more digital poverty. And the next phase of the study, where we're actually being able to go out face to face, is going to try and address some of the issues with digital poverty. So what did people say? Well, when we asked people, well, what resources do you use to keep well? We tried to avoid the terms anxiety and depression. We found young people often didn't feel very comfortable using those terms. People would describe themselves as being distressed or being upset or unhappy, but they wouldn't so frequently use the word anxiety and depression. And we found that people really valued their own personal resources. So what about themselves, their personality traits, their strengths, and the strategies that they used? That was one really big area, key area, as you can see highlighted by this person here in Buenos Aires. It was all around being able to accept problems and handle solutions and handle the situation to know that she could feel better in those cases. And linked to this was also this idea of personal development. Now a lot of the people talked about this in terms of academic or occupational development, but it also went wider than that. And people indicated that it was about sort of growing as a person and personal growth. And we know that brings in a lot of parallels with sort of post-traumatic growth, because many of these individuals within the study had various amounts of trauma in the past. And the next sort of main categories, which comes as no surprise, was, and this was something that came across when we were doing the exercise earlier, was this idea of social resources. So this was focusing particularly on the support that they receive from other people. And people really mentioned both their family and their friends, as well as other people. And this could be people from religious communities, it could be people within their school, people within their workplace, or just members of the wider community. So as one young adult said in Bogota, I believe it is fundamental, the support, the emotional support that family or friends can provide. Like someone mentioned, a lot of time you confide in your friends more than your family. And we found more so for young people, having strong connections with their friends was a real key to being able to overcome periods of acute distress. And quite surprisingly, or surprisingly for me as someone who is absolutely terrible with social media, that many of the young people actually felt that social media helped their resilience and helped their mental health. It was noted that social media could be a place of pressure, and it could be a place of comparison that could be negative. It was also an area that could lead to things such as cyberbullying. But in general, people valued having social media in their lives. Particularly during the pandemic, they saw social media as a way to maintain contact with their friends. And it was also a way to meet people and to be inspired by role models. And social media also afforded people a certain amount of anonymity, particularly when they were going through a hard time. People then talked about what resources are in the community, and also about the important role that mental health professionals could bring. And this was particularly for those people who were suffering from more formalised disorders like anxiety and depression. People would talk about accessing healthcare services such as psychologists, or going to their GP, or going to a psychiatrist when they knew or recognised that they needed help. But more widely than that, the community was seen as a real asset. And this was whether it was a cultural centre, whether it was church groups, whether it was dance centres. It was mainly what was most important was having some kind of activity or some kind of focus that people could turn to. And that was more important than what the actual activity was per se. It was about that sense of belonging that people could have and the sense of links that they got from being part of the community. And finally, linked to that was people talked about specific activities that they used. They also talked about these activities not just for keeping them well in general, but also when they were experiencing times of acute distress, that there were certain activities they could use to bring up their mood or to alleviate any problems. And these generally fit into four main categories, which were art activities. Just to say, it's not surprising that a lot of the arts were mentioned. I know we have a slightly skewed sample in that many of the young people were going to arts organisations, because the arts workshops tended to focus on people who were already using those arts services. So it's not 100% surprising that arts came out as a major feature. But even for the young people who weren't involved in arts organisations, arts was still seen as a really crucial way of overcoming distress. People also talked about leisure activities in general, and specifically being part of sports groups. Now, sporting activities tended to be more group-based, like going to a football club or going to a rugby club, whereas outdoors activities tend to be more accessing nature and accessing fresh air. So all of these helped us to develop questions that we're going to be using in our cohort study. So we condensed some of these down, and we used this information to actually record in our sample of around 1,600 young people per country, which of these activities, which of these resources they actually use. And just to highlight how to show some of the process, that we were able to use the arts in different ways. So here I just have some of the photos and some of the work that came out of these arts organisations and these workshops. So people drawing rather than being able to verbalise what anxiety means. So you can see this echoes things about the pandemic, but also things about climate change, which was a real big issue for young people. And then people using existing art and trying to show the situation, how they felt in the pandemic. This actually came from a theatre writing group in Peru, and the idea of what it felt to be trapped during the pandemic. And also this timeline from anxiety and despair through to feeling better. So work package 2, this is what we're currently doing now. We're currently recruiting, or the plan was to do all this recruitment face-to-face. And then you can just sort of see a few of the BBC News headlines around Latin America. So not only did we have very severe restrictions in Argentina, we also in Colombia had a mass period of political unrest, which is still ongoing. And in Peru, we know that Peru was perhaps the hardest hit country in terms of mortality rates from COVID. So our recruitment has used a mix of online and face-to-face, but we're now at the point where we have recruited around 1,500 people per country. And we actually found that around 40 to 50% of people were scoring up as having anxiety and depression, which was well above the 20 to 30% estimate that you would usually see. Alongside this, we've been running our experiential sampling method study. And here we had a small number of participants, around 50 per country, who are sent text messages with a range of questions. And this happens around 5 to 7 times a day. And they're asked to indicate what they're doing and how they're feeling. And this is all done via a mobile phone app called Imagery. So people are asked, what are you doing now? Where are you? How long have you been doing this activity? Who are you doing this activity with? And how happy or sad you're feeling, or how nervous or relaxed. And this not only gives them a picture of how their day is going, but we do this over a week. So we collect vast amounts of data for us to be able to analyse the impact of certain activities and whether being with certain people or being in certain locations is associated with different types of feelings. And at the moment, you can see that we've pretty much finished recruitment. And again, we're surprised that more people had anxiety and depression than we anticipated. And I think this really shows sort of the impact of the pandemic in Latin America. And the final part that we're doing, which is sort of an add-on to our cohort studies, that now we have this large cohort, it'll be around 4,800 people in total, of which a vast majority have anxiety and depression. We're also planning a number of trials within cohorts. And this is where we found the arts organisations to be so passionate and so much of a resource to young people that we're wanting to actually test their impact in a number of these trials within cohorts. So we're currently running 2, one in one in Bogota, run by Batuta, which is actually going to be testing a music workshop to see if that overcomes adolescent anxiety and depression. And then also a creative workshop run across Argentina and Peru, led by the other 2 arts organisations, which uses a range of different creative approaches to have a look at the impact on distress. So if you want to find out, it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I hope to come back next year and to be able to tell you the results of our cohort. We've now completed the baselines, or nearly completed the baseline, so we're going to be analysing whether there's any differences between the resources used by people who do have anxiety and depression and those who don't. And within a year's time, I hope to be able to come back and tell you, well, what helps people recover? Are there patterns of resource use? But in the meantime, we have the Aula study website if you want to find out any more information about the particular teams, any of the work that we're doing. And we also have a newsletter. We tend to do this every few months, just outlining the main points and what we're up to. So please do come along. We're a friendly bunch. We also have our Twitter and our Instagram accounts. Our Instagram account is very active in Latin America. So it's a great way of finding out what's going on in the Aula study. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much on behalf of the audience. And like Gem's, what an amazing body of work. Right, so we already have 3 questions in the Q&A for you. So for anyone else who has questions, I would encourage you to use the Q&A rather than the chat. So Vicky can be typing responses if we run out. So the first question, will studies such as these help change the paradigm from which CAMS works? So from an intra-individual to an inter-individual and community-based one.
That's one of the things we hope. One of the actual sort of reasons behind the Youth Resilience Unit was that we wanted to bring back some of the work that we were doing in Latin America to East London. to look at resource uses within the community, because we know in London and in East London in particular, we have a real strong sense of community. And we've also applied for other funding to do this work in the UK, particularly looking at the role of community and arts organisations, and whether or not we can support those organisations within the community to not just take the pressure off mental health services. I think we also need to think about it in terms of helping young people avoid going into services, because within the best will in the world, it's better for everybody if the person can get help without having to become a patient, without having to start that journey of needing help. And that's not to take anything away from the services we work with. We all work with some amazing services, but this is about empowering the community. So we are actively seeking to do more research to look at, well, how can we strengthen arts organisations in particular? And I suppose one of the key tensions and one of the key challenges that we've been faced with this work is that how do you strengthen the mental health response within those organisations without fundamentally changing those organisations? What we don't want to do is turn those organisations into mini psychologists, because that's not what they're set up to do. They're artists first and foremost. So how do you retain their uniqueness and their individuality, but also supporting them to work with some of the most needy, and I don't mean that in a detrimental way, I mean the people with the highest needs in the community. And that's something that we're actively looking to do here in London, but also across the world. But I think it can have, I do think it has the possibility to change the way we think about community-based services and community resources.
Okay, so next question. So if young people have remained mentally healthy and those who have become unwell have recovered without input from mental health services, who has identified the illness and consequent recovery?
So these are based on some large cohort studies that have been done in Latin America. And it's where, in a lot of cases, they use validated questionnaires to screen for distress, and then often a clinical interview is applied. But this is very much in the context of research and sort of cohort study research. So in our case, we're not quite going that far. So in our case, we're looking, one of the reasons actually we're looking at distress is we don't want to go down the route of saying, oh, this person has anxiety, this person has depression. Rather, we're just using a screen to say that they're experiencing some level of distress, and then we're looking at recovery. But in terms of the original literature that was presented, that comes from a range of cohort studies that have previously been conducted. There is the mental health study in Colombia, which is sort of an annual study, which our PI, Carlos Gomez Restrepo, he's very actively involved with. So we've used, or we quote data from previous existing studies, but they tend to use, scale-based measures, which are then followed up with clinical interviews. But it's purely research, it's not done within the context of services.
And then the last question, this is about the measure of social media. So was there an objective measure of the impact of social media?
Actually, that's a really good question. That's something that we actually really haven't been that good at grappling with, how to assess the individual impact. At the moment, what we used the data from the interviews was to create a questionnaire battery. And so this asks some questions. It asks people about the types of social media they use, the frequency, how often. And in the ESM study, obviously we're collecting data when someone says, well, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter. We collect data on how they're feeling and how that makes them feel. But in all of these studies, it's only going to be an association. So we're going to be able to say, well, a high social media use was associated with X, Y, and Z. It won't be able to provide causality. But what we're hoping is that when we come to do the case studies in Work Package 4, that any of the factors that we identify as being really important, we might be able to take those forward and actually do some more testing using some of these trials within cohort methods, and using further sort of qualitative and quantitative methods to disentangle the impact. But at the level of all the best we'll be able to say is that there's an association. But it's certainly an area for future research, because I think social media is often seen as negative for young people, without us also thinking it was, particularly in the pandemic, it was a good way for people to connect, particularly when you're in rural locations or when you're in sort of high density areas where you couldn't go out.
Okay, so I think that brings us to the end of our first half, which was very kind of inspiring and stimulating. And I think it's now time for all of us to take a bit of a break from our digital media as well for 15 minutes. So if you could all come back for 15:30, for 3:30, thank you.
I'm going to have to head off in a bit, but thank you.
Thanks, Vicky.
I'll just stay in case there's any more questions, but when we come back from the break, I'll then make an exit.
Right, okay. So welcome back, everyone, to the second half of the Youth Resilience Research Afternoon. So our third speaker today, Michael Pluss, is also from Queen Mary. Michael, are you back as well? Oh, Michael, if you want to put on your camera when you are.
Yep.
I just wanted to check that you were there first. So Michael is a chartered psychologist and a professor in developmental psychology, and he's based at the Department of Biological and Experimental Psychology here at Queen Mary, University of London. So Michael came to psychology after first being trained in chemistry and music, but his current research focuses are very much focused within developmental psychology, focusing in on environmental sensitivity, so the ability to perceive and process information about the environment. He also investigates resilience, mental health and intervention programs for the positive development of young people, and he will tell us a little bit more about that today. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks a lot, and thanks very much for inviting me and the opportunity to share a bit about my work, specifically the work that we have been doing with Syrian refugee children in Lebanon. So today I'll talk a little bit about that research, looking at their mental health and the resilience. So I'd like to start with a quick overview. So I'll first provide a little bit of background regarding the Syrian conflict, and that led to the massive refugee crisis quite a few years ago now, but it's still ongoing. And then I'll introduce our study, which is called Biopath. And within that, I would like to focus on three recent findings. So the first one is the prevalence and the predictors of mental health problems in our sample. And then I'd like to focus on risk and resilience factors that we've identified. And then the third one is I want to look at the change of resilience over time, something that has not been looked at in many studies yet, I would think. So, and then I'll end with the discussion. I have to say there's a lot that could be said about our study, and 25 minutes is relatively short. So we'll continue quickly, but happy to answer any questions you may have or point you to resources that we have with more details. I want to start with the background first. So the Syrian civil war began in 2011, so it's more than 10 years already, and was related to the political unrest to something called the Arab Spring, which you may remember that went across the Middle East around that time. Initially, that was a conflict between the Syrian government and a few rebel groups, but then has developed into a very complex proxy war involving various parties. And it seems like the whole world was involved in that war in some way. And it had detrimental consequences. It's not resolved yet. There are approximately 500,000 casualties, and 6.2 million Syrians that were displaced within Syria. We don't really hear that much about those people. We hear more about those that are externally displaced, which is 5.6 million. And most of these 5.6 or 5.7, that number is always a bit changing. Most of them are surrounding countries around Syria. So most of them ended up in Turkey, with almost 4 million. Then Lebanon has the second highest number of, at the moment, officially 840,000, but unofficial numbers are substantially higher than that. And at the height of the crisis, it probably was more like 2 million refugees in Lebanon. Lebanon itself is a small country with only 4.5 million Lebanese citizens. So you had, at the peak of the crisis, 4.5 Lebanese citizens plus 1.5 million Syrian refugees, plus about 500,000 Palestinian refugees. And then Jordan has quite a few refugees as well, and then some in Iraq, Egypt, and North Africa. So some further facts. Importantly, most Syrian refugees remained in the Middle East, and only slightly more than 10% of them were able to flee to Europe. That was obviously, that's one of the reasons why many of those refugees ended up in Turkey, because they wanted to come to Europe, but they couldn't because of the EU's decisions. And about 50% of Syrian refugees are children, and they are at risk of becoming ill, malnourished, abused, and exploited. Millions have been forced to quit school, and actually in our sample, even though we collected data between 2017 and 2019, a big number of these children, about 60% or 40% between the different waves, did not have access to school. And that was several years into the crisis in Lebanon. What do we know about the mental health of Syrian refugee children? There are several studies now, more and more studies coming out more recently. Most of them report high prevalence rates for psychological disorders based on samples in Turkey, Lebanon, and Germany. There's quite a wide range, as you can see, for PTSD, between 12% to almost 50%. Similarly for anxiety, from roughly 10% to, again, 50%. When we look at depression, it looks again the same, about 12 to 50%. So we do tend to find very large ranges of variability in those prevalence estimates. And that could be partially due to different methods to establish prevalence rates, but also due to different levels of vulnerability. And it also suggests that given these relatively high prevalence rates, even at the lower ends, they are relatively high, that suggests that there is likely a significant need for mental health treatment in those children. So I will provide some data about that as well, how many actually get the support that they need. So the BioPath study is short for Biological Pathways of Risk and Resilience in Syrian refugee children based in Lebanon. It's a collaboration between Queen Mary University of London with IDRAC, which is an organization focused on mental health, led by psychiatrists in Lebanon, and then Médecins du Monde, or Doctors of the World, who were responsible for the field work, and it's all funded by an NIH grant. So millions of children are affected by war and displacement, at the moment more so than ever, but I mean, at any time in the human history, probably quite a few have been affected by war and displacement. And we do know that many of them develop psychological problems, but that also some show remarkable resilience. So we wanted to investigate the biological reasons and mechanisms and underpinnings of such differences in response to war and displacement. Why are some children developing problems and others don't? And we did that by considering multiple settings. So we focused on the family, the school, community, neighborhood, and services. Access to services, we apply a multi-level approach that we consider social factors, environmental factors, psychological factors, but also biological ones, such as neuroendocrine measures, epigenetic, and genetic ones. I'm not going to talk much about the neuroendocrine, epigenetic, and genetic factors, but we're working on all of those as well. And importantly, we did not just focus on risk factors and maladaptive outcomes, but we also focused very much as well on protective factors and adaptive outcomes, such as well-being. But again, today, I'm not going to focus very much on the well-being outcomes. And it's a longitudinal study. It's an accelerated cohort design. Let me quickly show you the design. So we had measures of war exposure and displacement. We were interested in both risk and resilience outcomes, both psychological and biological ones. Then we looked at other environmental risk and protective factors, genetic factors, how they contribute to the baseline outcomes, how they moderate effects of war exposure on these outcomes, and then how these are mediated through DNA methylation. So this is epigenetics, and how that would impact then on the psychological and biological outcomes at baseline, and then we collected data again 12 months later. We also collected data again on DNA methylation and endocrine outcomes. Our sample includes initially 1,600 Syrian refugee children plus their primary caregivers, so we're looking at 3,200 individuals. The age range is wide, between age 8 to 16 because of the accelerated cohort design. And that data for baseline was collected in 2017, 2018. And then 1 year later, we followed up about 1,000 of those families. It wasn't the case that we lost 600 based on attrition, but that we always aimed to only recruit about 2/3 of the baseline sample. That's because of the high mobility of the sample. So we managed to collect the number of individuals that we wanted to collect in wave 2. We used a wide range of measures for the child and caregiver. So we have psychopathology outcomes, well-being outcomes, and then we looked at protective factors and risk factors across various levels. So the individual immediate social environment and the more wider social environment, and that was applying a ecological systems approach. We also mentioned the biological sample. So we collected saliva to look at genetic data. We use genome-wide data here, but also genome-wide epigenetic information. We focus on DNA methylation, and we collected hair samples to look at 3 specific hormones. And I have some information on the location. So here we have Europe, and here is Lebanon. And Lebanon, as you can see, is almost completely surrounded by Syria. At the south, it borders with Israel, but it's mostly Syria. And we collected data in an area called the Bekaa Valley, which is in the south and borders with Syria. So many of our settlements, we collected data in about 80 different settlements. Many of those settings would be fairly close to the Syrian border. And here is Beirut. I have some photos to give you some context. So this is a typical refugee settlement. They're all tented settlements. The majority of refugees, Syrian refugees in Lebanon, actually don't live in tents, but we focus on the most vulnerable refugees, or the more vulnerable refugees in Lebanon. So most of them live in tents like this. You can see here, they have satellite dishes on their tents. It's not a typical camping tent as we would imagine. So these are a bit more solid structures. And but it's a very rough place to live, and it does get wet, and they do get snow, and it's very difficult to live there. This is a picture of the team. So these are all the field workers that we had that were collecting data in interviews. And then this is how it happened. So each family was visited by a team of 2 interviewers. One of them was interviewing the child, and the other one was interviewing the caregiver at the same time. All the data was collected by the interviewer, and they entered all the data in tablets, so we could almost in real time see the data that came in. So none of the children or the caregivers were completing questionnaires. This was all collected through interviews. So this is a caregiver outside of the tent. So what did we find regarding mental health needs and treatment? So we had several questions that we wanted to address. So the first one was, what is the prevalence of mental health problems amongst Syrian refugee children? Then we wanted to know what are the predictors of these mental health problems. What is the perceived need for treatment of Syrian refugee children? That was an important question. One question is, how many people meet the criteria that we would interpret as having a mental health problem, but how many of them actually feel that they have a need for treatment themselves? And the last question asks, what are the common barriers to available mental health services? So the work that I'm presenting now is analyses that have been conducted by my postdocs, Dr. Fiona McHugh and Dr. Claudine Biazzoli. So first, the measures that we used. So we've used well-known mental health scales for depression, a brief version of the CSD, for the anxiety, a brief version of the SCARED. The PTSD was measured with CPSS, and for externalizing problems, we used SDQ items and as well additional items that were in order to get something that's more similar to, comparable to DMS-5. We also did clinical assessments in a subset of the sample. For that, we used the MINI, and in a clinical interview for children, adolescents. So that was done in a subsample of 134 children. And that was conducted in Arabic by local clinical psychologists and 2 trained counselors, either in the clinic or in the settlements. And then all these cases were discussed with the clinical supervisor before agreeing on a diagnosis. So that means we have prevalence rates based on clinical assessments in a small sample, on self-report in a total sample, and as well on caregiver report. And this is what we found. So I have it here for all the individual disorders. So first of all, with the clinical interview, we found a prevalence rate for PTSD of almost 40%, externalizing behavior of 27%, depression of 20%, anxiety was very high with almost 50%. And actually we found that, well, that was actually shown as well in the self-report measures. And, but before I go there, so you can see it splits up here in the individual disorders. What is important at the bottom, you can see any common mental disorders, and that is almost 60%. So that was in the clinical interviews. Then based on these clinical interviews, we created cutoffs for the rest of the sample. And we only had PTSD, externalizing problems, depression, anxiety as measures in the total sample. And you can see applying the cutoffs from the subsample results in very similar prevalence rates in a total sample. And the anxiety measure is actually one that didn't work that well in our sample. And the reason is that probably the anxiety was so high in our sample that it really didn't differentiate between clinical level anxiety and non-clinical. Then we also asked the caregiver, after they completed questionnaires on their own PTSD, their own depression, anxiety, whether they think their child has the same problems. And it was interesting that with that simple question, we get fairly similar results when it comes to PTSD and depression, and a bit lower for anxiety. So that's sort of prevalence. Again, important is that that suggests that one in, or at least every second child seems to have clinical level mental health problems in this sample. Then we looked at as well the comorbidity. And I'm not going to go into detail here, but what you can see is that most children have some level of comorbidity. So it's not that we have a large proportion of the sample that score high on PTSD, but not on high on any others. But most what we see is PTSD comorbid with anxiety or any of the other disorders. So high comorbidity in this sample. And then we looked at the predictors. And so we looked for the individual outcomes in the whole sample. So we looked at age, gender, time since leaving Syria, but also the effects of war events, the quality of the current environment, and the caregiver-child relationships, and maltreatment conflict, as well as caregiver mental health symptoms. And what we do find is that the exposure to war was generally associated with higher problems across the board. We also find that actually the strongest effects is that a higher quality of the current environment is associated with lower problems across all the outcomes except anxiety. For anxiety, it wasn't significant. We also find that maltreatment within the caregiver-child relationship is a risk factor across the board, across all of those items. Similar for conflict. And then very important, caregiver symptoms was an important risk factor. And that shows as well in the next set of analysis that I will show. So I'll just have to quickly move on to the next. When we ask the caregivers whether they think their child needs help 25% of them said yes, their child needs mental health service or treatment, and that's what we provided. We also asked them a little bit about their past use of services, and they were only less than half of the sample were aware of services. The services that they used were mostly community-based, but as you can see, very little used services. When we asked them the reasons for not using services, most of them said they don't think they had a need for treatment. There was quite a few that were not aware of the services, or they did not know how to access them, and then some concerns about costs and transport issues as well. So the next set of findings is about risk and resilience. So we wanted to know how many Syrian refugee children are resilient, what differentiates resilient children from those that are at risk, and how does resilience change over time. And this is work by my PhD student, Cassandra Popham. So we defined risk and resilience as positive development despite adversity, or maybe better said, not developing mental health problems in response to experiencing adversity. That means we used our cutoffs here, and if a child was below the cutoffs for depression, PTSD, and externalizing, we consider them as resilient. And when we did that, so applying this multidimensional approach, about 20% met the criteria for resilience. If anyone was above one or more of the cutoffs, we put them into the risk group, and that was the remaining 80%. What we did then in the next step is we looked at war exposure. We created different types of war exposure, so bombardment, other directed violence, up to bodily harm. So depending on the different types of war exposure that children experienced, they were allocated to those different categories. And we did that so that we could match children that are in the resilient group with one child in the risk group that had similar war exposure. So here we have the resilient group on the left and then the matched risk group on the right. So we matched them all, and then we run logistic regressions to look at the differences between those groups. And you can see here the results. So we have a long list of predictors. The most important ones were self-esteem. So the group in the resilient group had higher self-esteem. The risk group had caregivers with higher PTSD, high experience of child maltreatment, caregiver with higher risk for depression, and then also these children experienced more loneliness or social isolation, and environmental sensitivity, which is a temperament trait that increases the risk to develop problems in relation to an experience of adversity. Then the next, we wanted to look at change in resilience over time. So we have the baseline, and then we have the follow-up. And what you can see is there's actually quite a bit of change over time, in that about half of the children that were resilient at the baseline remained resilient at the follow-up. But the other half, they actually deteriorated, and they fell into the high-risk group a year later. In the high-risk group, there was a large proportion of the sample that stayed at high risk, but then there were a considerable proportion that actually improved over time. So we see that in total, the proportion in resilience increases, but there is considerable change between those groups. So that some people that were in the high-risk group are doing better later, but also some people that were initially resilient, they actually fell into the high-risk group. We then looked at what characterizes these groups, and it's very similar to the other slides. So children in the high-risk group had higher sensitivity, higher parent-child conflicts, higher child maltreatment, and had caregivers with more mental health problems. And in the stable low risk, these children had higher self-esteem, they experienced more maternal acceptance, less child maltreatment, and they had caregivers with better mental health. In the next step, we then looked at the bi-directional relationships, which is very important. I'm just having here one example, and that is the relationship between child mental health symptoms and caregiver depression. So you can see over time, a child that has higher mental health problems predicts higher caregiver depression, but also caregiver depression at baseline predicts more child symptoms over time. So that suggests that we really have to look at the system of the family rather than just focusing on the children themselves. So to summarize that, in my last minute, mental health problems are frequent. Every second child reports significant problems. And about for half of those children, the caregiver requests mental health treatment. So that means even with those 25%, that there is a significant perceived need for mental health services and initial willingness to use them. But the majority of these children actually never receive treatment due to various barriers. We found that about 20% of the sample met our criteria for resilience. This is less than in other studies. Often resilience rates are 50% or 60 to 65%. The reason that we found lower is that we considered multiple dimensions of resilience rather than just focusing on depression. If we would have focused on one individual outcome only, then our conclusion would have been actually all the other children seem to be resilient. But if we consider multiple dimensions of mental health, that group becomes significantly smaller. So we identified various individual and social factors associated with risk and resilience. So many of the children that actually in our sample that were offered treatment, they never received treatment. And that suggests that we really have to, in that particular environment, we should identify the identified predictors point to the family and the social context as being particularly relevant, which many of you suggested in your answers already early on. So that suggests that interventions should focus on the individual child, but also on their social context, also on their parents, but also the family itself. So standard delivery of treatment and programs in and through clinics is probably not going to reach children in need. So we need to involve community-based approaches, and something that we did is to provide treatment over the phone, which was helpful as well. So that's all. Just want to acknowledge here all my research partners. There's a large team that has been involved in collecting this data, and obviously we thank the families that contributed to this study as well. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that very kind of important study and challenging, I imagine, as well. So are there any questions? There are two questions in the Q&A. So the first is, what secondary gains impact on reporting? Was secondary gains impact on reporting considered, and how was it controlled?
Secondary
gains impact.
I'm not sure I understand.
That question might have come up when you were talking about self-reports and parent reports, perhaps.
Oh, I think I have an idea. Yeah. I guess the question is, will have families over-reported mental health problems because they thought they would get more help? So this is a concern that we do have to some degree, and we try to control that by reducing, by clarifying what this study was about. And but I think there still were some people that probably said they would like to have help in the hopes that they would get some financial support of some sort. So that was difficult to report, difficult to control. But I think it's definitely a concern that we've heard from some people, especially with the additional work that we did on the clinical treatment that we provided, that some people initially said yes, but when we got back to them and they realized they're not going to get additional support, anything else than treatment for mental health, they were no longer interested. So that could be an issue.
Next question, what is maternal acceptance? What treatments are available? Have an evidence base in this setting?
So a few questions. So maternal acceptance is the parenting reported by the child. So how much do they feel they are supported and accepted? So it's emotional support and feeling safe with your parents. Then what treatments are available? In this setting, much of the treatments is provided either individually in clinics that are difficult to access, or then group treatment approaches that are delivered in various settings. But generally, the treatment that is delivered is fairly limited in a sense of that people have to go to the place where it is being delivered. And Lebanon doesn't have a public transport system, so it's quite difficult for people as well. a lot of the help, and actually the hospitals are open during work hours, and many of these refugees will be working, often not legally, so they are actually not able to access it. So that's why we provided treatment over telephone, which improved access considerably, but still we saw a limited uptake of the offer. That was an issue.
Yes, so actually follow up to that question, and kind of similar to the previous talk, that this question is, should the intervention be community-based and not medical psychological, given the high universal rates?
Yes, I absolutely agree. That's sort of our takeaway from the research, is that absolutely, unless mental health support is provided within communities and ideally through the communities themselves by empowering community members, many of those children that need help will never see the support that they actually need, because there is also limited understanding of what mental health problems are in children and what help is actually available. So when we went into the communities and we talked to mostly the mothers about those problems, there was a very few that felt that their child has a need for the treatment, but they were clearly worried about it. But many of those children do not have access to school. They're quite bored and isolated. And I think a community-based approach would be the most promising one. Absolutely, yeah.
Next one, any idea of the prevalence of self-harm and suicidal ideation amongst your sample?
I did not assess that for ethical reasons, and that wasn't possible. We did have some cases with children at risk of suicide in our treatment arm of the study. Those were quite few, so I can't say much more about that.
Very last one, stigma about mental health, would that have been an obstacle for the study?
I don't think it was an obstacle for the study. For our study, it wasn't an obstacle, but it might have been an obstacle for the clinical arm of our study, where we tried to recruit people into receiving treatment. And actually, it was quite interesting because in some of the communities, we asked them about stigma or how it is perceived. In some of the communities, it seemed to be an issue in that people they said that I would not go and seek help for my child's mental health problems because I don't want my neighbors to find out, or my neighbors would judge me for that. And in other settlements, that was less of an issue. But I think stigma is an issue, especially that there is not necessarily the stigma that people will judge others for mental health, but there's just a lack of understanding of what mental health means. For example, when we provided or offered mental health treatment, one of the families didn't want to get involved because they thought it would include brain surgery. So there's just, I think, a lot of psychoeducation that would need to happen just to inform people, your child experienced trauma, your child experienced trauma. These are the sort of the behaviors that are to expected when you have those experiences, and here's the help that would be available. I think that would be something as simple as that would probably make a big difference already.
Okay, thank you very much. I noticed that you had about 60 slides there, so at some point I might try and invite you to come to sort of tell us the whole story as well.
Yeah, there's a lot more that we're working on, and the biological side of it, yes.
But thanks for the taster. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to introduce our last speaker today. So thank you to the audience for bearing with us through all these kind of talks. But I think all the speakers have been really good at keeping to time. Apologies, Taryn, we've gone into 3 minutes of your talk. But if you want to start sharing your screen. So Taryn Hutchinson is a PhD student at King's College London. Her research is funded by Mental Health Research UK. And unlike the other speakers today, she's going to talk to us specifically about a new treatment protocol for adolescent depression. And just to note that Taryn's kind of background before starting her PhD was as a psychological wellbeing practitioner with young people with low mood and anxiety. And it was in this role that she became passionate about furthering the development of early intervention support for young people, but whilst also being aware of some of the limitations of current treatments. Okay, I will pass on to you, Taryn.
Brilliant, thanks Jennifer for the introduction. Hi everybody, thanks for having me to talk to you today. So as Jennifer mentioned, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview about a treatment we've been delivering here at King's College London, aiming to help improve sort of treatments towards particularly anhedonia within depression in school-based population. And the intervention is called Imagine PA. So I'll in a minute discuss what that stands for. But just as a bit of an overview, what I'll be talking about largely today is kind of first of all giving you a bit of a background of, and hopefully a kind of research justification of how we've gotten to developing our intervention. So I'll quickly and briefly talk about sort of the background of depression and current treatments, and think about how mental imagery use links to depression, and also its use in young people, but also thinking about resilience, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, how use of mental imagery has perhaps impacted young people. Through my literature review search that I've been doing during my PhD, I've come across various strategies for how we can harness positive affect as a way of kind of treating anhedonia, which has again led to what we'll be including in the sessions of our intervention. So just a quick overview of the intervention before I go into any other details. So the intervention is called Imagine PA, and the PA stands for positive affect. It's a 4-session school-based psychological intervention, and it's focused around using positive future imagery as the means of increasing positive affect in young people. And as I mentioned, it aims to target anhedonia specifically within depression by trying to upregulate positive affect. So kind of holding those things in mind, I'm going to go back a bit to kind of the beginning of what led us to want to kind of create this intervention. So when we think about depression, so I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with depression and what depression is, but I think historically we often think about it as a sort of negative affect side of things, so low mood, sadness, distress, crying, irritability, that sort of side of things, which it very much is, but actually there's the other hallmark symptom of depression, which is anhedonia, which is this loss of pleasure and enjoyment, and reduced motivation, and things like that, which can be conceptualized in the literature as a reduction of positive affect. And certainly I think historically treatments have really focused on trying to reduce negative affect, and largely I think they do this really well. As Jennifer mentioned, in terms of my background, that's certainly something that I was very familiar with. But as we're starting to see in the literature that actually decreasing negative affect isn't the same as increasing positive affect. And certainly through my experiences, and perhaps some of you have experienced this too, that treatments for depression might work so far in the sense that a young person might say, I don't feel as bad as I used to. But often my experience was they maybe didn't feel fantastic, or they didn't feel great, they didn't feel good. Some did, but some perhaps were struggling to get beyond feeling less bad. So the idea here is that, as I said, decreasing negative affect doesn't necessarily mean increasing positive affect as well. So and the literature does seem to suggest actually that these systems of negative and positive affect are separate, and perhaps historically treatments have focused more on decreasing negative affect. So that was one of the rationales for this treatment approach, was to try and increase positive affect. Similarly, current treatments tend to focus on talking therapies, which are usually verbal techniques that can either focus on the here and now or the past. This particularly in depression, things like focusing on unhelpful thoughts, for example. Often again, particularly in relation to positive emotions. Mental imagery is more closely linked to our senses, which can be really helpful in terms of bolstering positive affect. So that was, again, a justification for within this intervention. Whilst we definitely still incorporate our verbal techniques, we wanted to explore the role of mental imagery as a new technique to try and increase positive affect. So in terms of how mental imagery links to depression, there is evidence that unhelpful emotional and mental imagery is associated with the development and maintenance of mood disorders. So, for example, distressing and unwanted memories of negative life events, of significant negative life events, they're associated with symptoms of low mood and dysphoria in adults. But similarly, distressing and intrusive images of the past have also been shown to maintain depression in young people as well. And furthermore, symptoms of depression are uniquely associated with sort of reduced vividness of positive mental imagery. So I guess the idea is being that particularly vivid negative mental images and reduced vividness of positive future imagery are really tied with symptoms of depression. And indeed, some research in young people explored relationships between the severity of negative life events and symptoms of depression. And within this research, it was found that actually adolescents that had greater vividness of positive future imagery, this relationship between negative life events and depression was reduced, which suggests perhaps a protective influence of positive imagery, which again, when we think about resilience, is quite an important thing to bear in mind. So again, it kind of gave us a bit of a justification that actually positive future mental imagery is a really powerful technique that should be harnessed within treatments of depression in young people. And as we've heard with a lot of the research today, the kind of studies that have been adapted to look at as the pandemics hit. So within our research, we explored the role of mental imagery in terms of symptoms of negative affect and anhedonia during the pandemic. So as I mentioned earlier, that actually depression isn't necessarily just characterized as negative affect, but also anhedonia. And often we just have one measure of depression, and particularly in the mental imagery literature, this is very much still a new field. So we were really interested in actually trying to see if there were differential relationships between negative future imagery and positive future imagery, and how they linked with negative affect and anhedonia specifically. And what we found was that increased negative future imagery and reduced positive future imagery were both predictors of negative affect, whereas only reduced positive future imagery predicted anhedonia. We also looked at the role of mental imagery in changing the relationship between the impact of COVID stress and negative affect and anhedonia. And we found that individuals who had vivid negative images of the future, there was a stronger link between the impact of COVID stress and negative affect. And similarly with individuals who had less vivid positive future imagery, there was a stronger link between COVID stress and anhedonia. But really interestingly, we found that in individuals with high positive future imagery, this link between COVID stress and anhedonia disappeared. It was no longer significant, really suggesting again that protective role that positive future imagery can have within symptoms of depression, which just leads us on to just thinking in the interest of time a little bit. I'd also done a literature review thinking about how we can use different techniques to harness positive affect. And some of these techniques, without going into them in too much detail, we've kind of taken and implemented in our intervention. So you might have heard of behavioural activation before, but augmenting it with things such as savouring activities and positive future imagery, for example. Things like kindness and generosity and gratitude exercises, as well as identifying goals and values, are all types of exercises that have been shown to increase positive affect. So moving quickly on to thinking about how Imagine PA has been developed. It's really building on a previous school-based imagery intervention called Imagine by Victoria Pyle et al., who aim to reduce depression in young people by targeting memory specificity, imagery rescripting of negative memories and generating positive memories. Because again, as we've shown, kind of negative past images can really impact on depressed symptoms. And Imagine, it was co-developed with young people. And the idea of kind of Imagine PA, as well as trying to build on harnessing positive affect using imagery. Imagine was initially developed to be delivered by a clinical psychologist. So the idea of somebody like me as a psychological wellbeing practitioner with sort of less extensive specialist training was another aim of this project. And we presented our ideas about Imagine PA to the King's College Young Person Advisory Group, and we got some really encouraging feedback that in terms of positive future imagery, this was something that they'd never really heard about or done in therapy before, and seemed quite interesting and novel to them. So briefly, I'm just going to run over what each session involves within Imagine PA. So the first session involves some psychoeducation around understanding memories and mental imagery, and how they link with our emotions. And then the second session, we really focus on positive future imagery generation and these techniques of savouring and reducing dampening thoughts, as well as introducing the idea of self-compassion, all as ways of kind of harnessing and building positive affect. The third session, we then focus more on positive future imagery for longer term goals. And again, we use techniques of savouring to harness positive affect. And then finally, in our fourth session, we focus on identifying values and summarising what we've done in the sessions and kind of helping young people kind of continue using these strategies moving forward. So that was a real whistle-stop tour of kind of my research today, and also our intervention on Imagine PA. So if anybody's got any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them, or if we don't get through them all today, my contact information is here if you want to contact me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Taryn. You have 1 more minute.
Oh, fantastic. I did think I was rushing there a little bit to the end.
Right. Okay, so let's look at questions. So sounds like a really nice intervention. Can you give an example of how you would help a child generate positive future imagery, and how do you do the savouring exercise? Yeah, really good question. And so in terms of, I think that's a good question, because it's quite a novel thing that perhaps we don't even do that much ourselves. So the way we do it in the intervention is we ask young people to think about, so in the second session we do short-term images, and then in the third session we do longer-term images, so goals, sorry. So in the shorter term, I might say to young people, is there anything in the next 7 days that you're looking forward to? And maybe if they've got a couple of things, kind of say which one you're particularly looking forward to, and then get them to pick that, and then ask them to start generating it in high levels of detail. So things like, what can you, okay, describe the scene for me that you're there, what can you see? And then we try and get them to engage all their senses. So what they can smell, what they can touch, how they, and really notice as well how they're feeling whilst they're generating this image. And that's where that savouring really comes into it, and kind of saying, whilst you're in this image, how do you feel, what emotions are you feeling, what do you feel in your body, and getting them to really tune into that and trying to kind of hold on to those feelings a little bit, and kind of talk them through whilst they're in the image. Yeah. So following on from that, someone else has asked, do you think it has some similarity with hypnosis?
I mean, a really good question. My expertise don't extend beyond hypnosis, to hypnosis, sorry. So I have less knowledge about what is involved in hypnosis. So I couldn't comment probably too much on that. I don't know if anybody else has any experience with hypnosis.
Okay, that's okay, but something to think about.
Yeah, definitely.
So another question for mental imagery, what if they can't think of anything they're looking forward to or anything positive in those with more severe forms of depression?
Yeah, I think that it's a really important thing to think about, especially where we are within our intervention development. So I suppose as well, the target that we're aiming for at the moment is sort of a school-based population as a more preventative approach. So at this stage, we probably wouldn't be seeing young people with severe depression anyway, who might struggle with generating images. Having said that though, I think strategies of, if they were really struggling to think about anything that they would enjoy right now or in the next 7 days, for example, even thinking about things they might have enjoyed in the past a little bit to kind of generate ideas might be useful, and then kind of trying to say, could any of these happen in the next week? A little bit like you might do with your behavioural activation or something like that as well, where you're wanting them to plan and implement activities, even if they're not necessarily thinking that they would be positive things, kind of helping and kind of co-working together to kind of think about how that could be a positive event to try out.
Yeah, thank you very much, Taryn. There are a few more questions in the Q&A, so I wonder whether or not for this last bit you could answer them on that forum.
Yeah.
I'm aware that we now need to do a feedback survey.
Sure, no worries, thank you.
Thanks, Taryn.
Jennifer, I think that the feedback survey is probably something which Charmin is going to send out. I don't think we need to do it here now. Charmin?
Yeah, we can do a few more questions towards the end and then finish up. The feedback link will be shared on the chat.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so Taryn, are you okay to answer those couple more questions to an audience?
Yes. Do you want me to answer them over mic?
Yes, please, yes.
Yeah, sure, let me put my camera back on. It might actually be a bit quicker than me typing. So one of the questions was, has this been done in ASC young people? Which again is a really good question. It's something that we as a team have been thinking about as well. In terms of our intervention at this stage, knowing sort of individuals with ASC and they having particular needs, at this stage we've actually not been including them in our criteria, just because it's a sort of a stepped approach where, in order to make sure we know how the intervention it kind of works at kind of baseline before we can adapt the intervention to individuals with more kind of specialist needs. So we haven't at this stage used it in young people. I know one of my colleagues is aware of kind of imagery research being done in young people or in people with ASC as well. So it's certainly something we want to kind of consider in the future, but at this stage we haven't. Thank you. Another question was around, is there any creative output in sessions, maybe making images with art materials or after the images are being formulated? So I really like this idea, actually, as I quite like arty stuff myself. But I suppose in terms of the sessions that we do or the kind of after sessions that we do at the moment are probably more focused around, we have an app that we ask people to kind of generate positive memories, and we send them a word to think about positive words, and it is much more text-based, but it's actually really interesting, especially because we are generating images. It's a really interesting idea to, if there's some young people that would like to express that through kind of drawing or kind of some form of artwork, that could actually be really something for us to think about incorporating. So I really like that idea, thank you. I've got one more question. Do I have time to answer that one as well, Jenna? Yeah, brilliant, okay. So the question is, do you think there's any value taking some of the principles behind this therapy for those of us that see children in mental health crises, e.g. in A&E, following strong suicidal thoughts. Have you looked into such approaches in acute settings? So another really good question, and I might have touched upon that a little bit. So at the moment, our intervention is more focused on the preventative side of things, being a school-based intervention. More broadly speaking, though, the kind of research around anhedonia and links with suicidality, there's definitely links there, and particularly around the idea that reduced positive future imagery and kind of reduced motivation and things like that can contribute to suicidal thoughts. I think it's a really interesting idea, and whilst we haven't explored it in acute settings, again, it would be useful to think about how that might work and as an avenue for the future. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much to our line of speakers. I knew that as a four that it would work really well because there have been such different approaches, two of them being studies in London, but also in global contexts too, where there are, of course, also pressing mental health needs in this age group. I also want to thank you as an audience for all your kind of questions and engagement, and also with the responses from the warm-up exercise too, which we'll also take into consideration when we are planning our very own youth resilience cohort study as well, which hopefully we can tell you more about at some stage. So I think that's all from me. I'm going to pass on to Frank to see if he has any closing.
So yeah, just also a big thank you from my side. And I think it just demonstrates that we've waited far too long to have a youth resilience, drop research now as well, unit in the mix really of our academic profile, because I think primary and secondary prevention is crucially important for not only younger people, but I think we can learn a lot in terms of community-based approaches to fostering resilience from the research we heard about today. And I think it was also nice to hear about a rich portfolio of interventions, kind of sort of stepping outside of the traditional talking therapy framework, which is close to my heart, as you know, Jennifer. And I think the kind of creativity that flows really from many of those interventions, again, can be utilized for treatment, but also for preventative purposes. So yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing much more from the unit really in due time.
Thank you. And there's a feedback survey for everyone to complete on stage. But thank you all for your attention.